Greetings and welcome to today's virtual MIT Starr Forum, Amazon Burning, COVID-19, Ghost of Climate Future. I'm Michelle English, and on behalf of the Center for International Studies, I'm honored to have with us today Dr. Carlos Nobre and Elizabeth Leeds. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the Center for International Studies and the MIT Brazil program, and my colleagues, Laura Kerwin and Rosabelle Coelha Cassá, for their help in making this event possible. We had long been looking forward to bringing Dr. Nobre to MIT. Of course, we could have never predicted a pandemic would prevent this from happening. Whether we like it or not, the world has changed. It looks completely different now from how it did a few months ago. It may never look the same again. We have to choose a new way forward. Those are the words of Greta Thunberg at an Earth Day event celebration on Wednesday. My hope is that we will choose a new way forward, and I'm certain that Dr. Nobre will help us choose wisely. Before we get started, I'd like to invite you to future Starr forums, including next Thursday, for a talk on violence against women with human rights experts, including our very own Hala Al-Dasari. And finally, I'd like to point out that we have time for Q&A at the end of this talk. Please use the Q&A feature on the toolbar to submit your questions. At last, it is an honor for me to introduce our moderator, Dr. Elizabeth Leeds. Dr. Leeds is a senior fellow at the Washington Office for Latin America, where she advises work on citizen security and human rights in Brazil. She has served as a Ford Foundation Program Officer in the Foundation's Brazil office and is the co-founder and honorary president of the Brazilian Forum for Public Safety. From 1989 to 1997, she served as the executive director of the Center for International Studies, and she received a PhD in political science from MIT. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Leeds.
Thank you, Michelle. I would like to welcome everyone to this most timely Starr Forum. Not timely not only because of the subject, the threat to the Amazon and climate change, and its relation to COVID-19, and also because of the relevance in the commemoration of International Earth Day, which Michelle mentioned, which was officially on Wednesday. And of course, every day should be Earth Day. It's a tremendous honor to welcome Professor Carlos Nobre to MIT, his alma mater, to CIS, and to this virtual Starr Forum. Seja bem-vindo, professor. Professor Nobre, who is speaking us from Sao Paulo, is the former chair of the Scientific Committee of the International Geosphere-Biosphere Program. He's the former director of Brazil's Center for Earth System Science, the former scientific director of the National Institute for Climate Change Research. He's chair of the Brazilian Panel on Climate Change and co-chair of the Science Panel of the Amazon. His research interests include tropical meteorology, climate modeling, and global environmental change. Professor Nobre received his PhD from MIT, as Michelle mentioned. So please join me now in welcoming Professor Nobre. And I want to remind everyone, as just to reiterate, to submit your questions by clicking on the Q&A button on the bottom toolbar.
Good afternoon to all. Initially, let me thank MIT, the Starr Forum, for this kind invitation. If not for the pandemic, I would be enjoying spring in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But anyway, we will have to learn how to live under this crisis, and perhaps we will come out of this crisis much better as humanity. So the question that was posed to me was whether Amazon burning and COVID-19, are they ghosts of a climate future, for the planet, for humankind, and I will try to address those two issues. And I will anticipate my answer. Yes, they are ghosts of climate future for humankind. Let me start with a very quick introduction of the history of Amazon occupation and development. When the Europeans came to South America 500 years ago, the indigenous population in the Amazon was estimated between 5 and 10 million people. Natives always have considered the forest and wildlife as a cultural and spiritual value. On top of that, keeping the forest almost totally undisturbed was also a way to reach an ecological balance with millions and millions of microorganisms that inhabit tropical forests, and there were practically no large-scale cases of zoonotic diseases that would have devastated indigenous populations. They were in balance with the ecosystems, with all its integrity. The main cause of almost extinction of the indigenous populations in Brazil was not slavery or assassination. By 1940, there were only 70,000 indigenous people in Brazil, from several million up to 10 million to 70,000. They were going extinct. In fact, the main reason for that, it was contagion to diseases brought about by Europeans. There were many episodes of miners, land grabbers, or land speculators giving gifts such as clothes to indigenous communities contaminated with pathogens such as measles that provoked unspeakable genocides. That was the main reason for the almost disappearance of indigenous populations in Brazil and also many other parts of the Americas. The resource-intensive mode of development of the Amazon since 1970s was based on the false premise that there is no economic value in the forest. The forest was named Green Hell. The motto the military government of Brazil coined in 1972 was, "The occupation of the Amazon will follow the cattle footsteps." Indeed, that's what happened, where around 70% of cleared forest in the Amazon ends as a very low productivity cattle ranch. A cultural mental blindness of the total importance of maintaining the forest has dominated the political power of most Amazonian countries today, even today. Science is more and more demonstrating that all benefits of keeping tropical forests standing, they are of course a natural mitigation of climate change for retaining hundreds of billions of carbon in the biomass and acting as a very important carbon sink. There is a tremendous potential for an innovative bioeconomy, and a bioeconomy of forests standing and rivers flowing. And science is trying to unfold that potential. And now the pandemic does not leave any doubts about the necessity of keeping tropical ecosystems in balance to reduce the risk of a continuous succession of epidemics and pandemics. The Amazon is burning, our house on fire. Let me address a little bit the importance of forests, tropical forests in particular. Tropical forests are unique ecosystems in terms of its interaction with the atmosphere. They exist where there is a lot of rain and short dry seasons, usually shorter than 3 months. That's why they call rainforests. They are not only a passive response to a climate driver of large rainfall in the tropics. They in fact create conditions for more rain. It's almost an evolutionary mechanism for survival. They keep evaporation all year round at very high levels in the Amazon. The water vapor injected in the atmosphere increases rainfall levels, especially during the dry months of the year. Therefore, the forest, by drawing soil moisture deep down with a deep rooting system, creates the conditions to more rain and for its own maintenance. In sum, the forest very efficiently recycle water and increase overall rainfall by 15 to 25%, primarily during the dry season. That makes the inside canopy environment very wet, and fires rarely propagate inside the forest, the undisturbed forest. That is, the Amazonian forest is resilient even to lightning strikes that ignite fires in many dry forests and savannas across the globe, like the bushfires in Australia, the fires in California forests, Siberia, etc. But the forest is under three anthropogenic drivers of change acting simultaneously and synergistically. The first one is regional deforestation that reduces the water recycling process and increases surface temperature. About 17% of the Amazon forest has been cleared, and another 6 to 10% is in various stages of degradation, fragmentation. Second, climate change due to global warming also increases temperature, has increased about 1.5 degrees the temperature in the Amazon, and also has an overall effect of increasing the seasonality of rainfall with an annual decline of most of the Amazon basin. The third anthropogenic driver is warmer temperatures, forest degradation, and proximity to man-made fires also has increased significantly the vulnerability of the forest to fires. As I mentioned before, undisturbed forests are very wet. Even a lightning ignited fire would not propagate. But now the Amazon forest is becoming more and more vulnerable to fires. These three drivers are being large tracts of the forest very close, are bringing very large tracts of the forest very close to a tipping point. I will explain. Observations reveal that worrying picture of the proximity to a tipping point. Over southern and eastern Amazon, the dry season has increased by 3 to 4 weeks over the last 30 years, with longer dry season in areas heavily deforested. Temperature during the dry season is much warmer, 2 to 3 degrees in those areas. Evapotranspiration over those areas, the evaporation plus transpiration, has also decreased. And also, this carbon sink, this natural behavior of tropical forests, all forests in the world, but also tropical forests, the carbon sink strength is dangerously declining in those areas. This is southern, eastern Amazon, mostly in Brazil. In the 1980s and 90s, the Amazon was a sink of 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which was about 7 and 8% of total emissions of carbon dioxide. Today, that number is much less, and some tracts of the forest in southern Amazon have become carbon source. So the combination of warmer temperature, fragmentation, increased deforestation, and man-made fires has created the conditions for much more forest fires. That is becoming much more vulnerable to fires. The forest is becoming. And the most worrying observation is that in the southern and eastern Amazon, species of trees, which are typical of very wet climates, they are showing a higher mortality rate. It seems that this process of a large-scale change is already occurring or about to occur. So considering all those things together, science today indicates that between 50 to 70% of the Amazon forest is very, very near an irreversible tipping point of savannization. It may be turned over a dry savanna in 30 to 50 years. That would mean losing something like 200 to 300 to 300 billion tons of carbon dioxide, complicating even more reaching the Paris Agreement goals. It would also mean a gigantic loss of tens of thousands of plants and animal species, and of course, spilling over an incredible number of microorganisms, increasing tremendously the risk of future epidemics and pandemics. The situation today is very worrying. Deforestation rates almost doubled in the last 12 months, and fire reached a 10-year record last August. Pollution caused by the fires last year in the Amazon made the Amazon in August the most polluted place on Earth. And we know, let's say, just looking at how COVID-19 vulnerability of people to pollution. Polluted cities like New York City, the risks of death by the virus is much higher. So that might happen again during this year's burning season. Let me move now to talk a little bit about the COVID-19. When and where the next pandemic will emerge. What is really a likely path to our next zoonotic pandemic? Ecological imbalance make it quick and effective for pathogens, virus, bacteria, and other pathogens with high host plasticity to move to birds, bats, rats, monkeys, insects, cattle, pigs, chicken, etc., and then animal to human spillover viruses. An amplification of human to human transmission, as we've seen happening, unfolding at a gargantuan scale during this pandemic. This is the case for many of the well-known epidemics and pandemics in the last perhaps 100 years, but certainly in the last 40 years. HIV, Ebola, bird flu, swine flu, MERS, SARS, Rift Valley fever, West Nile virus, Zika virus, dengue, chikungunya, and the new coronavirus. A dangerous zoonosis is really appearing every 4 months. Tropical deforestation and fires change radically the complex ecological balance between microorganisms and animals. Corridors of contagion are constantly and growingly being created by miners, hunters, colonists, timber loggers, land grabbers that can carry new pathogens to urban centers and spread quickly and eventually globally. Wet markets, bushmeat, illegal trade of wildlife, all of that is present in the Amazon. Really, it's not clear why no global zoonotic pandemic originated in the Amazon to date, since all factors of disturbance and risk are present in there. Perhaps sheer luck, one might say. Let me just address briefly one very serious issue that we are very concerned here in South America, in the Amazon, which is the vulnerability of indigenous population in the Amazon to COVID-19. The national crisis in Brazil and other Amazonian countries due to this pandemic has led to a relaxation of law enforcement in the Amazon against illegal mining in indigenous territories and land speculation and grabbing. That was a process that was going on for several years, did not start this lack of law enforcement. 80 to 90% of deforestation fires in the Amazon are illegal. So it's a Wild West type of environment. COVID-19 can seriously bring serious threats to indigenous and traditional population. A study published this week indicated that over 80,000 indigenous population are under the risk of death due to this new coronavirus, which is something like 8% of the total indigenous population in Brazil. that can only be avoided with a very strict lockdown of those communities until the pandemic is completely over. And of course, health assistance to those populations, something very rare. So very large tract of indigenous population are at a greater risk in Brazil today from this pandemic. Why these two things, Amazon burning and pandemics, may combine and are becoming ghosts of a climate future? Any failure of not reaching the targets of the Paris Agreement of keeping the global temperature increase below 2 degrees may present tremendous risks to the planet. For the Amazon, as I mentioned before, global climate change, deforestation, and increased vulnerability to fire puts the tropical forest at the brink of a tipping point of large-scale urbanization. That might happen over 3 to 5 decades, resulting in a gigantic spillover of viruses, bacteria, and other pathogens to humans, increasing dangerously the risk of unpredictable zoonotic epidemics and pandemics. COVID-19 is the most serious warning that we must seek immediately sustainable pathways for humankind. That calls for restoration of ecological balance of all ecosystems, but particularly tropical ecosystems. That's where it houses millions of different species of virus, bacteria, and other potential pathogens. Massive forest restoration also brings the natural climate change mitigation solution. 1 hectare of restored forest in the Amazon removes between 12 and 15 tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere a year for about 25 years, a natural climate change mitigation solution. COVID-19 has brought to all of us globally the enormous sacrifice of flattening the contagion curve to save lives, given the capacity of health care units. The Earth has also a limit to its capacity. Climate change presents a great risk of exceeding such capacity, and we must also flatten that curve of risks by reducing emissions of greenhouse gases urgently and increasing removals of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, particularly carbon dioxide, through a massive forest restoration program, a global forest restoration program. And this forest restoration program is very important to happen also in the Amazon. As I mentioned, the Amazon, large fraction, perhaps 50 to 70%, might be turned into a dry savanna within 3 to 5 decades. One way to fight that back, to reduce the risk, not to eliminate it, but to reduce, is restore large fractions of deforested areas. As I mentioned, cattle ranches, livestock farming is very low productivity in the Amazon, less than 1 head of cattle per hectare. So if we move to a sustainable intensification of existing activities there, we may have a very large area, something like 300, 400,000 square kilometers. And we have to restore forests, particularly in southern and eastern Amazon, to try to reboot, let's call it, reboot the water cycle, reboot the capacity of the forest to recycle water efficiently, to increase rainfall in those areas, to reduce the increase in the dry season length. So that's one way, one strategy. Does not really guarantee saving the forest, but at least we have to move in that direction. Let me just conclude by saying, with respect to the Amazon, climate change and pandemics, we are already at a crossroads, very close to an irreversible tipping point. One clear learning from the pandemics is that we have to listen to science, as Greta Thunberg has been echoing for climate science. Listen to climate science. A recent Gallup poll indicated the trust in science has been high all over the globe, perhaps one of the few good news that the pandemics is bringing about. And the growing anti-science and fake science movement is somewhat weaker, but did not disappear. Protecting human life is showing global collaboration of the scientific communities of almost all countries. Lessons learned from this pandemic must serve to prepare all of us to face the gargantuan risks that climate change poses to life on Earth and to our own survival. We must right away raise planetary health at the same level of importance as human health. In that way, protecting tropical forests, especially the Amazon, is an urgently necessary global endeavor to be carried out by all Amazonian countries and by all of humanity. Let's raise the voice of science to guide us for a sustainable future and our voice in unison to save the Amazon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Nobody, for this inspiring talk, which has also inspired a number of questions from our listeners and our viewers. But I would like to start off with one question, which is related in a way to your last point, your last statement about raising the voice of science. You've mentioned, and it's common knowledge throughout the world, that marginalized sectors of the population, low-income communities, prisoners, migrants, and especially indigenous populations are the most vulnerable and ultimately suffer disproportionately from COVID-19. And in the case of the Amazon diseases, you mentioned measles. There's also diabetes, tuberculosis, malaria, HIV. These are all risk factors for a disproportionate percentage of the population. And we know that the removal of the protection of this population, whether it's through mining, farming, cattle grazing, as well as by the reduced powers of FUNAI, the Indigenous Affairs Ministry, also drastically affect climate change. So my question is, what is the likelihood of significant opposition and pushback to these destructive policies, either from within Brazil or from international organizations or people outside the country?
That's a very good question. And actually, I would love to answer your question very optimistically, saying yes, this global concern about the pandemics is changing our perceptions about many things, about risks. People in general, they were not as concerned about the risks that we are inflicting to the balance, ecosystems balance, ecological balance in its integrity. And now we are all thinking about that. Finally, the voice of science is being heard much more. And as I mentioned, apparently the anti-science, fake science movement that was growing like crazy in the last 5-7 years is kind of not speaking out, including things like, which seems to be an absurd today, and anti-vaccine movements. So anyway, we are, however, how to translate that into empowering all these people. So this is not a simple matter. I would say, I hope that that we could really just use this global concern about how important it is to keep ecological integrity, that we move to a different type of agriculture, that we also move, let's say, to a different type of economy. I mean, there are a lot of studies and some examples showing circular economy is the way into the future. A circular economy requires much, much less minerals, much less primary products that really are at the heart of this destruction of tropical forests. So I hope that we will more quickly move out of the unsustainable path that humanity was taking, most of humanity, most of the countries for centuries, that we will really adhere to a sustainable path. Of course, that depends on the populations. The populations have to push for that. We see some good news coming from European countries. They are discussing moving out of the pandemic, out of the economic crisis, onto a Green Deal. We are seeing that, some other countries discussing that, not all of the countries. Unfortunately, this is not a discussion that has reached the level that we think we should have reached in the US, but also in Brazil. And in other Amazonian countries, it's mixed. There are countries which are more concerned, like Colombia, are countries which have protected forests much more effectively, Suriname, Guyana, French Guiana, but this is not a consensus in the Amazon. In Brazil, where most of the Amazon is located, 63% of the forest is in Brazil, and still there is this big debate. But I hope, I'm hopeful that the world will come out of the pandemic with a different, very, very different perception on the way we should relate to nature, to indigenous populations, to other minorities, to traditional people. Also, I mentioned to you the study that was released this week about the risk of 81,000 indigenous people to death, but also this is not indigenous people only. The riverine populations all over the Amazon, they are very susceptible to contamination and also to die. So we are at the brink of a critical moment. If we fight that back, if we flatten this curve of pandemic, and collectively we do that as a national and international movement, really abiding by science, being guided by the best science, and perhaps we will emerge in a new world in which climate change denial movements will lose power, because it's really something that for us in science, it seems to be almost impossible to understand, because how solid is the climate science. And still, we are moving towards the Paris Agreement goals very, very slowly. We are putting the planet at a great risk. The risk of climate change, uncontrolled climate change, is even unthinkable. Unthinkable. We cannot even predict what's going to happen in the planet if we lose equilibrium in ecosystems, if the Amazon forest disappears, if all tropical forests disappear. So it's a different world. We cannot even think or dream about or even find out. Even science would have a very hard time predicting the outcomes, but it will be terrible. So really, I think I'm optimistic. I think in all my life, I have never seen a global concern, the seeking a balanced way of progressing. Perhaps that will make us really go on board a sustainable pathway. Science is showing a lot of the ways. We can have food security. We can have energy security. We can have water security without disturbing the planet as we are doing. Science is providing solutions. A lot of scientists, and particularly MIT, which is a technological-oriented, powerful house of science, is studying, promoting solutions, but we are not adopting those solutions at the pace that we need. I hope the pandemic will raise the flag and we will really abide by what a safe way for the future of the planet requires.
Thank you. And now let's move on to the questions from our viewers. We have many, and I will try to be just in my selection of these questions. The first one is from an anonymous attendee. Given the increases in deforestation we've seen in recent months in the Amazon, what should we expect in the burning season? How might COVID affect land use in the Amazon for the remainder of this year?
Well, if before the pandemic, of course, we were, very concerned because in Brazil there is a political discourse coming from the president, coming from sometimes high level politicians, some Brazilian Amazon state governors, not all. There is a mix of political discourses, but in a way that, going back actually to the 70s and the military discourse, which was not very popular for several decades. In Brazil, there was a reduction of deforestation from 2005 to 2012, 83%. So, and then stabilized for several years, and then start increasing in 2016, and then exploded in 2019 and early 2020. So the projections were not really very optimistic. The projections were, aligned with this political discourse. The illegality will even flourish even more. A TV show in the last Sunday got an interview with people grabbing indigenous land. And this guy gave an interview to this reporter, said, I heard, the president's speech that we have to take the Amazon land because, the indigenous people do nothing. So that communication, which is completely misguided and even illegal, it goes against the law, was really creating incentives for a model of development that we would like to see in the distant past, decades ago. We thought we were abandoning that model, but it's coming back. So let's say the projections were not very good. And of course, the pandemic means less law enforcement agents. All the law enforcement agents older than 60 years, they are obliged to stay confined at home for health reasons, correct concerns. However, I think, the pandemic is bringing something new, is bringing the risk to all those populations. And the contact of illegal gold diggers, illegal miners, illegal land grabbers to indigenous communities, to riverine communities, can really bring the death rate to a catastrophic level. So I hope the government, all governments, state governments, federal government, federal police, environmental law enforcement agents will also do their best. Satellite monitoring of what's going on in the Amazon daily shows all the illegality, daily. If you want to act, you just based on this very good information and you go out in the field and you can really decrease the reason of the high decline in deforestation rates 2005, 2012, many studies show was law enforcement. So we have really to talk very loudly, to ask for law enforcement, and really to take the crisis, the pandemic, in a way to avoid a catastrophe. So I'm not saying we are going to avoid that catastrophe, but this is one opportunity we have to reap and really to see ways to go out, to be very critical if deforestation and fires increase in the next few months.
Thank you. There's another question which is quite interesting, having to do with the seemingly reduction of pollution during this time of COVID-19 because people are driving less, economic activity has decreased. And so the question is, there seems to be a lot of positive sentiments regarding COVID helping with climate change, with the economic slowdowns, less travel, etc. So I'm curious to think if you think this is really a significant impact, and do you think it could lead to complacency for societies to think that this shutdown is enough to tackle climate change, at least for now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was born in São Paulo, São Paulo city in 1950s, a long time ago. And, I tell you, I don't recall in my childhood, I left São Paulo when I was 17. So that is 1951 to 1969. I don't recall having seen a sunset as beautiful as the sunsets of 2 weeks ago, because pollution was reduced something like 50 to 60%. And most of the pollution in São Paulo city comes from fossil fuel combustion engines, buses, trucks, cars. And of course, I'm sure, many studies are being carried out to get a good metric on the benefits, on health benefits. We know, globally speaking, about 4 million people die prematurely in the world due to air pollution, mostly from fossil fuel combustion, for external air pollution. So, certainly this is true everywhere in the world. And so it's really very clear that we can move towards that. So the pandemic also gives this opportunity, symbolic opportunity, because it's very difficult to predict that as the pandemic is over, pollution will not go back to the previous levels. However, we can see, all generations, all people living, particularly in big cities, they are seeing with their eyes beautiful sunsets, clear skies, animals coming back, birds, insects. I can see here, even in my hometown here near São Paulo, we see many more birds, insects, all. So the ecosystem is kind of regaining strength. So it's a short vision, a shortcut of a vision that what we would like to see. So I hope many studies will come out soon, scientific studies showing measuring the benefits of this narrow window of opportunity to see what a future would look like if we abandon fossil fuels and other pollutants. And we can do that. As I mentioned, technology has shown solutions. They make sense environmentally. They make sense economically. We are just very slow in adopting, for instance, electrification of the fleet. In countries like Brazil, where most of the energy, electricity is generated not on fossil fuel power plants, it's water and also more and more wind energy as well. So, if we switch to electrified fleets, we reduce tremendously the pollution, increases the health of all Brazilians. So that we can see. I think also the pandemic we will never be able to have that example, that we would be convinced. We have to show scientifically the benefits, and then I hope the populations of all over the world, including developed countries, including China, will press for moving towards a fossil fuel free world which is necessary, mandatory for keeping climate, keeping the warming, global warming under control, less than 2 degrees, but also will increase tremendously the health of the population.
Thank you, Carlos. It's very frustrating. There are some wonderful questions and many of them. So I know I'm going to have to neglect a large number of them, but let me ask this one, which is what is being done in Brazil to protect the indigenous population, particularly given the new appointment of an evangelical missionary to head FUNAI?
Yes, this is very words. When this new government came into office, they tried some things that do not make sense at all. Changing the Indigenous Affairs Bureau, FUNAI, to from Ministry of Justice to Ministry of Agriculture, and then the Supreme Court vetoed that. It went back to justice, changing all the leadership of this agency, and clearly demonstrating that the protecting indigenous rights was no longer a priority. Many of these authorities, including the president, giving speeches saying, calling the indigenous ways of life, indigenous culture as primitive. He said, I quote, we have to take them out of the zoos, indigenous territories as zoos. So, and then more recently, they appointed evangelical missionary for one division of FUNAI, which deals with isolated indigenous groups. There are unknown number of isolated groups which refuse to get in touch. They've been suffering a lot in the past, so they took the decision to be isolated. There is perhaps over 120 groups all over the Amazon basin, perhaps 35 or 40 groups in Brazil identified. And there is a doubt, because one serious issue throughout this contact of indigenous people, it was with the evangelical missionaries. They always try to get close to the indigenous populations, to write versions of the Bible in indigenous languages, to convert to Christianity indigenous groups. So they were very close. So this closeness of these people actually was also a factor in the past of transmission, disease transmissions, a very serious impact also. So we don't know what this new head of this division will do, but certainly appointing evangelical missionary for that probably meant symbolically that still in the heads of these people, you have to convert all indigenous groups to Christianity, which is really something which goes completely against respecting human rights of the indigenous population. We have to respect. They have their own culture, their own beliefs, their own religions. So, and why we think our beliefs, our religion is superior. So this is a concern. We are really concerned about that. We have to see what his actions will be.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. And if I'm wrong, Michelle and Laura, please let me know. This is a question from somebody representing the investment and financial industry. And it says the following: we in the investment industry are promoting the role of capital in influencing decisions. If nature is not valued in investing in business, then expect more deforestation. What support from the Brazilian or the global investment community have you seen, if any? And are you hopeful? And this viewer wants to thank you for your work and sharing your insights today.
This is a very important question. And the uptick in forest fires last year in the Amazon really raised that issue, which was kind of always discussed, but had never reached a global perspective, a global concern. So a lot of impact investment companies, funds, they got together, for instance, the Association Principles of Responsible Investment, PRI, they got together and they start really becoming more serious about do not supporting investments in the global tropics, in particular in the Amazon, which would lead to more deforestation. So the concept of deforestation-free supply chains gained a lot of weight, a lot of convincing power towards the investment, the impact investment. So impact investment is becoming more and more important. There are many impact investments in investment funds, for instance, which do not fund coal-fired power plants. This is very important. And also, we are seeing more and more now the concern about not investing in activities which would drive further deforestation, further disappearance of tropical forests. So this is essential. This is essential. And that has to be side by side with consumers' decisions. If consumers were really very careful about looking at the origin of a product which comes from Brazil, Amazonian countries, rainforest African countries, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, etc., and that they really require a certificate of origin, a certificate that did not lead to more deforestation, more fires, deforestation will decline very rapidly because there is so much wasted, cleared areas. As I mentioned, this ridiculous low productivity of livestock farming in Brazil as a whole, but also in the Amazon, particularly in the Amazon, you could have much more production, even of grains, using no more than 50% of the cleared area. And then what I think impact investment funds should also pay attention is the potential of this new, what we call standing forest bioeconomy. The standing forest agroecological systems producing acai berry, producing cocoa, producing Brazil nuts, and a large number of other products from the forest are much more lucrative than cattle, than soy. They maintain the forest standing. They improve the livelihoods of all those people working in those agroecological systems. So I think, and also they provide something that we need as human beings more and more in this century. We need to improve our health by diversity in foods. We have really to open completely. We eat only a few, 85% of protein and calories intake of 6 billion people in the world comes from only 12 products, 5 animal protein products and 7 grains. So, we have really to open up, and the tropical forests have an infinite potential of producing many, many more products for food, for beverage, for industry. So that's the economy investment funds have to be concerned. It's a new economy, but the economic potential and the social inclusiveness of this new economy is vastly superior than the current economy of mining and of agricultural products. So I would, really encourage the person who asked this question to bring to discussions the tremendous economic potential of a standing forest economy.
Thank you so much, Professor Nobody. And before we close the forum, would you like to make any final comments before we say goodbye?
Yes, I just want to make one comment because this was organized by MIT. You know, one idea that came to my mind because I did my PhD at MIT. At that time, it was called Meteorology Department at the Green Building, beautiful building, from 1977 to 82. And then, of course, MIT always was in my mind during the 5.5 years that I spent at MIT. I got to get to know many people from engineering, from physics, from technologies, even from biology. So I could see what wonderful creative environment MIT is, inspiring environment for not only forming us scientists, but also, creative new ideas. And MIT, of course, after that has become one of the leaders in finding solutions for a sustainable planet. So it occurred to me, and I start discussing this not very much, but still it's an idea that I hope I will be able to motivate some people, including MIT. Why don't we create an MIT in the Amazon? Why don't we create a school with the quality of MIT in the Amazon? Associate with MIT. MIT could help in the creation of this. Let's bring high-tech school of forming also scientists, forming the entrepreneurs that we need in the Amazon for sustainability, doing the state-of-the-art research that really is the basis for any new economic model, understanding what's going on in the Amazon. Why not having a university or a school? I prefer to call a technological institute. We are actually calling an Amazonian MIT or AMIT, Amazon Institute of Technology. So I would like really to end this very nice conversation with you, really raising this issue. Why? Because we need to find a sustainability pathway for the Amazon. We need to improve the quality, the size, the strength of science and technology in the Amazon. So it's not only necessary to do outside of the Amazon. We have to bring this capacity to bear into the Amazon. So my final remark would be to save the Amazon, not only a global endeavor, a very urgent one, but also we have to bring knowledge. We have to construct a knowledge society, and having an Amazonian MIT would certainly help that a lot. I want to thank you very much, Professor Liz, and all colleagues for giving me the opportunity to talk to you.
And thank you once again for this inspiring talk and your inspiring answers to all these questions. I remind you once more that our next Starr Forum will be on April 30th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the theme of violence against girls and women in the case of Saudi Arabia. Details of the event are available on the CIS website. Thank you all.